Hello friends, today we'll study clustering algorithm is known as k-means algorithm. In this clustering algorithm, we have to understand the basics of clustering first. The clustering is the classification of objects into different groups, or more precisely, the partitioning of the data into subsets or known as a clusters. So whenever we have studied classification, so we'll be knowing the topics or the classes before we go for classification. But in clustering, there are no predefined classes available, no labels exist. So what we do is we will get the data, understand the features available with all these objects, and depending on these objects, we'll try to classify them, and then we'll define that as a class. So according to that, we can define a multiple classes with which we will be able to define a cluster as and when required. So these clusters can be defined with different features, and one of the method that we can use is measuring a Euclidean distance between these objects. So whenever we have multiple objects, what we do is will convert these objects into a graph or into a Euclidean space. So when we have these objects placed, so according to the features of that, so we'll find the Euclidean distance between the objects for defining or converting or adding that particular objects into a class. So this Euclidean distance formula can be used for defining the distance between the objects. So K-means algorithm has multiple objects exist, and we are supposed to define, or we are supposed to convert them into a particular classes. So the classes that we are going to define may be known as k number of classes. K is any integer number which can be defined before we go for clustering. So let us say if we say that k is equal to 2, then we will be considering two classes for the clustering. If we go k is equal to 3, then 3 clusters may be created while execution of this particular algorithm. So accordingly, we can have any number of k depending on the data sets or the objects available for the partitioning. As we say that k-means clustering is an algorithm to classify or to group the objects based on their attributes or features into k number of groups. This is a general methodology that we apply under the k-means clustering algorithm. So whenever we think of clustering the algorithm, so we are supposed to define the groups, and whenever we go for defining the groups, so we are supposed to assign the object in a particular group. So for that, we are supposed to minimize the distance uh, between the cluster and the object that we are going to add into that particular cluster. But the same time, we are going to make a larger difference between two clusters, so that those two clusters can be easily differentiated and considered as a unique or individual class. So this is how the k-means algorithm works. So we start with a number of elements, number of objects that we are available. These objects are provided input to this particular algorithm. But at the initial stage, we are supposed to define how many number of clusters that we are going to define for the execution of the algorithm. So k is the value. So if we say k is equal to 2, then 2 clusters will be formed. So when we provide these two, and we'll consider the randomly we can define any any two objects as a centroid of that particular cluster. So according to that particular centroid, so we will find out the distance between the objects and the centroid. So the new object which is closer to the centroid will be added to that particular object. If it is closer to the new or a different cluster, then that particular object will be added to the respective cluster. So as we keep on adding objects into this, so we are supposed to find the minimum distance between the objects. So when we add a new object into that, so according to that we are supposed to find out a new centroid with that. So this grouping will be done. So adding elements into a centroid will be done by understanding, by calculating the distance between the centroid and that particular object, and we'll make a group of these particular objects known as a cluster. So we are supposed to have a stop condition. So if no object is available which is to be added into the cluster, then we will say that okay, there is no objects available hereafter, so you can stop this particular execution. Otherwise, if we have if the object or if the cluster is not changing hereafter, then also we can say that the algorithm execution is done and will stop. If no, if more objects are available, then we add the object into the cluster, find a new centroid by adding that object into this particular cluster, and this centroid will be further used for calculating the distance of the objects available nearby. Then the objects are added by using distance, by calculating the distance, and this process will go on and on. So for executing k-means clustering algorithm, we are supposed to follow 4 different steps. The first step is begin with a decision on a value of k. Number k is nothing but a number of clusters. So whenever we are supposed to define the k number of clusters, so this will be there is no specific criteria for that, but depending on how many number of objects you have which are used for clustering, depending on that we can assume or we can define. So but the k should be smaller than n. N is nothing but a number of objects that we have been provided for clustering. So once we define, in the first step we are supposed to define the k, how many number of clusters we are going to form in this particular execution. In second step, put any initial partition that classifies the data into k clusters. So this partitioning has to be done, and that should not be very specific. This is a smaller or initial stage of clustering that will be defined on the data which is available. But the clusters, as we know, the number of clusters are already defined. This is done in second stage. Third stage, take each sample in a sequence, compute the distance from the centroid of each of the cluster. So if we are supposed to add a new element into the cluster, we are supposed to check that particular object is closer to which particular centroid. So for that we are supposed to find out a distance between all the centroids and that particular object. Once we found that a particular centroid is closer to that object, then that object will be defined or assigned to that particular cluster. So if a sample is not correctly in the cluster with the closest centroid, then switch this sample to that cluster and update the centroid of the cluster. This particular part will be done in the latter stages, second, third, and so on, because as we keep on moving the centroid by calculating the centroid after adding new elements, then definitely we will be getting a new centroid each time, and that time some of the objects which were previously added into X cluster, those are going to change into a new cluster, that is Y or Z or something else, because the adding new elements into the cluster will define the boundaries of that particular cluster, and that may change time to time. Last stage is repeat step 3 until the convergence is achieved. That is until a pass through the training sample causes no new assignments. If we know that all the objects are already added into clusters and no more changes are going to happen in the clusters hereafter, then we can declare that the clustering is done. Otherwise, we'll keep on doing the same process step 3 again and again. Then what is step 3? Step 3 is, as we have initially defined the clusters, then the new element will be added into a cluster, then calculate a centroid, and according to the centroid calculate the distances between the object and keep changing the objects into one or another cluster depending on the distance. The closest distance from the object will be added to that particular cluster. This is an example. So for understanding k-means algorithm, so we have the examples here. A, the objects are available. Objects are nothing but the samples. 1 to 7 samples are available. A and B are nothing but the attributes, we can say. Here we can also define that as a x and y location, as if those are converted from the attributes to the graphical representation. So here we have defined k is equal to 2. So two initial clusters have been defined. According to that, 1 and 4 are considered as initial centroids or cluster points, so that the further stages can be calculated. So according to that, cluster 1 has a centroid, that is 1.0 and 1.0. It is already initially available. So for point object 4, it has 5.0 and 7.0 as attributes or centroid points. Then we'll keep on adding the objects into the cluster 1. So we have added 2 into a cluster, and as we have added two object into this cluster 1, then this particular two objects will create a new centroid, because this centroid is now changed as we have added a new element into it. So according to that, we have added a third element into this particular cluster, and according to that, the centroid has changed its position. So similarly, we have added 5 elements into this particular cluster, and according to that, we will get a new centroid here, and likewise the centroids will change as we keep on adding the elements. 6 is added into this particular cluster, the centroid is changed. The 7 is added into the cluster and the centroid is changed. So as we keep on adding the elements into this particular cluster, then the centroid will change, and this change in centroid will allow us to add the element which was there in the previous cluster into this particular cluster, because the previously added element may be closer to the newly created cluster. This may happen. So according to that, the clusters will change, the boundaries will change, the positions of the objects will change from one cluster to another cluster. According to that, we will get a clusters something like this. Cluster 1 will have 1, 2 and 3 elements, and the centroid is this, whereas cluster 2 has 4, 5, 6 and 7 elements, and the centroid is this. This is a reference, and thank you. So this particular algorithm is based on clustering method. We have already studied classification, and this is a clustering method which allows us to understand the requirement of the classification based on clustering. Thank you.